They knew Paul. He might come back there and visit again later. So people knew who this letter was from. They knew it was from an apostle, so the church would preserve and take care of those writings. Eventually, over time, and we're going to start talking about this, they started to gather them and started to recognize, okay, we need sort of a list of what are we accepting as being from God through the apostles and the other writers. Okay, we talked about non-biblical writers, so people that were sort of the next generation of Christians after the apostles, after the first Christians. And, they're not inspired writers, but these are scholars in the church. These are leaders in the church that, study the apostles' letters, study the Old Testament, write about God, and a lot of that is helping, the Christians to learn. So the non-biblical references, there are many non-biblical references to the letters of the Bible. Okay? So Irenaeus, who was a Christian, who lived about 180 AD, so you're 150 years after Jesus, in his writings about the apostles, about Christ, about Christianity, how to live as a Christian, he quotes many letters and that become part of the New Testament once it's all gathered together. He quotes or refers to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, 1st Peter, 1st John, and Revelation. So that's only 150 years after Jesus lived. That's only just over 120 years maybe after Paul finished his writings, 100 years after John wrote. And already church scholars are recognizing writings as being from the apostles, being inspired, being authoritative to the point where they would quote them or refer to them in their teachings. By the early 3rd century, so AD 200 to 300, Origen, a Bible scholar who lived in Egypt, he was using the same 27 books as are in our present New Testament. So it shows very early that Christians had recognized which writings were authoritative, which were from the apostles, or writers like Luke that were inspired, and those were recognized and respected and treated differently than just non-inspired writings. There is a Bible, a manuscript Bible, from AD 350, so handwritten manuscript as we've talked about, where it was gathered together and bound, put together, and that includes the New Testament with the same 27 books that we use in our Bibles. Well, why am I emphasizing this? Lots of people have the wrong idea in their head that, hundreds of years later, people that believed in Christianity started writing things about Jesus and sort of creating a background in these documents that then people said were from the 1st century. And people dismiss the Bible that way, to say, it's not, these aren't documents from the 1st century. That's not true, and the evidence doesn't support that idea. These things that we're reading are based on things that were written in Jesus' time or right after, and respected and preserved, quoted, referenced by early Christians. Any comments before we move on to the next slide? Anything anybody would like to mention? Okay. Well, why did it become so important to collect and protect the Bible writings? Well, part of it, the Christians, if they're recognizing this writer wrote from God, of course you'd want to preserve it. But there were other things happening that made this really important. February 24th, AD 303. This is recorded in Roman history books. The Roman Emperor Diocletian orders the destruction of all Christian writings in the Roman Empire. Different emperors treated Christianity differently. Some were like, that's fine, we'll add your God to our shelf with all the other gods, in the Roman Empire, and as long as you obey the laws and are a good Roman citizen, that's fine. Other emperors, not so much, because Christians wouldn't worship the idols in the empire, the other idols. And then an earthquake or something would happen, and the emperors, the leaders of those other cults or false religions would say, the gods are punishing the Roman Empire because the Christians won't worship them. So that would result in Christians being persecuted quite often. So this emperor decides, we're going to wipe it out. Well, if you think about the effect that would have on the church, if you know that there's been a Roman decree from the emperor to destroy all Christian writings, and you lived at that point, and you're a Christian, how might that impact you and the church? Rob? We get a microphone to Rob.
I think probably as a Christian it would make you stronger. And you would want to hide whatever you had from the government officials, right? Mm-hmm. To preserve God's word.
Right. Right. Both
You're
those
in preservation mode, basically.
Okay. So it's going to could make you stronger, right? It's nothing like being tested and persecuted to cause a person to think, what do I really believe in? What am I willing to risk my life for? What am I willing even to die for? And which writings are important to protect against the government at the risk of our own lives, imprisonment or being executed. So writings that aren't inspired, we're not so worried about those. You might not want to lose things that Irenaeus and others wrote, but they're not inspired writers. But these writings, where Paul, Luke, John were inspired by God, we must protect these because these are from God. Okay? So if you've got to decide what to protect, you have to have a way of deciding what's inspired, what we would call scripture that we're going to protect. Okay? Now, the opposite happened a few years later. AD 312, the Emperor Constantine, he becomes a believer in Christianity based on a vision, and he legalizes Christianity. Makes it a legal religion, recognized in the Roman Empire. And he goes even further than that. AD 331, he orders that 50 Bibles be produced in Greek. That's a major undertaking. That's not hitting print on your computer. That's, as we've seen, handwritten parchment, 50 he wants made to help support Christianity and have the teachings wider spread in his empire. Okay, the emperor has said he wants this. What do we include in these Bibles, as we would call them? Which of the letters do we include, which don't we? What's from God, what isn't? So again, that was a big factor in consolidating what now has become the New Testament. Here's the oldest known scrap of a New Testament manuscript. You can see the texture of the paper. We've talked about papyrus, that reed-type plant that grows Africa, very, very common in Egypt along the Nile, and you take it and you slice it, and you pound it flat, and then you weave it and you make paper out of it. Okay. So this is a piece of papyrus. The text is written in Greek. It's written on the front and the back, so it wasn't part of a scroll. It was put together in what we would consider like a book. John 18, 31 to 33 is on the front. John 18, 37 to 38 is on the back. Can I get one person to put their hand up and read the first one, and another person to read the second one? put your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you. Okay, Rob will read the first one for us. John 18:31 to 33.
Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute anyone." They objected. They took the place. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death that he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?"
Okay, and 37:38. Larry, thank you.
John 18:37-38.
Yeah.
"You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him."
So this little piece of papyrus has those verses of John written on the front and the back. Scholars have dated that small fragment to about 100 to 150 AD. So very close to the events of the New Testament. And this fragment was bought by a man he bought it in Egypt in 1920. You know, in many countries where people dig up and find ancient things, you know, if it's not formal archaeologists that are going to protect things and make sure they end up in museums, lots of times there's a real black market for selling antiquities, and people make a lot of money out of it. So I didn't write down the details on who bought this, but that's the background of this fragment that now is in a museum. So it's been dated that this was written down on this papyrus about AD 100 to 150, discovered and realized and found and authenticated in 1920. What does that existence of this do for us in our belief, our understanding of the New Testament? Get a microphone here.
I think it reinforces the fact that this writing has come back from that far back and everything.
Right.
We're seeing examples of findings that it existed and that these words were actually written, and it's the words that are in our Bible these days.
Excellent. So what you are reading when you turn to John, right? Things like this authenticate that what you are reading was written thousands of years ago, very close to when the events that it's describing happened. Now, a whole nother discussion is a study of, did someone make this up when they wrote it, or were they recording real events? And that's another discussion. But there is really strong manuscript evidence for the things that have been included in the Bible that we take as things that were written by early Christians and by the apostles. It also shows that back then, people recognized the value of these writings and were preserving and protecting them and distributing them, disseminating them. Right? This was in Egypt, not in Israel. Now, those aren't far apart, but it shows that these manuscripts were being, copies were being distributed amongst Christians. Okay. I mentioned the Sinai Bible, called that because it was discovered in a monastery on Mount Sinai. It is the earliest complete New Testament. Again, handwritten on vellum, so that's the skin, goat skin or sheep skin that's been cured, the hair scraped off to make something more durable than papyrus as paper. Okay, so it's, again, handwritten, and as we've talked in previous lessons, when they did this, They marked out columns. Every column had to be a certain width, a certain length, a certain number of letters in every line, a certain number of spaces between paragraphs. When they had finished a section, they would count in the original how many letter alphas in counting their copy. I missed one. Burn the copy, start again. So that was the process behind making these copies. This was found in a monastery in Sinai. It's written in that capital, what we would consider like capital letters, Greek. And that copy, that Sinai Bible, contains most of the Old Testament also. Not all of it, but most of it. And that page is showing, is Matthew 6, 4 to 32. So, complete, collected New Testament like we have from 350, so 250 years, 300 years after the apostles were writing. So let's look at this on a timeline then. Does this have a pointer on it? What do I push? The green one. Oh, great. Okay. Thank you. Oh, now. Okay, so if we look at this, the New Testament, and again, these are estimated dates. Scholars don't all agree, but written in this period here, between 50 to 80 AD, so not a very long time period. Clement, who was not an inspired writer, but was an early Christian scholar, there's copies of his writings from 95 AD where he is quoting books that are in our New Testaments. Ignatius, same thing, in his writings, is quoting or referring to some of these writings. So very close to when they were written. Justin Martyr in 150. That oldest fragment of John, someone wrote that in this period here, very close to when the originals were written. Okay? We talked about Origen and his Bible having the same, his New Testament, referring to the same books that we have in our New Testaments. And then the oldest complete Bible, New Testament, 350. So this to us looks like a big gap, but in the world of ancient manuscripts, it's not. And you're going to see that as we look at some other things. There are other ancient writings, for example, of Plato, Homer, where the copy we have is thousands of years separated from the original. This gap between what we have, manuscripts, and when it was first written for the New Testament is very small. Let's compare it to some other writings that people consider sacred. Now, I'm not saying they are. I'm just saying other writings that people consider. How would the Bible compare? So I've done a little bit of reading about Buddhism. I'm no expert by any stretch of the imagination. But this is when I was teaching this material in Cambodia. So the original man that people call Buddha, he lived 563 to 483 BC, so 500 years before Jesus. He did not write any of his teachings down. His teachings were passed on orally. So when he taught, people would listen to him, and then they would quote him, or what he taught would be said orally, but it wasn't written down. Later, his followers started to write down things that he said. There's no agreement on one common list of his teachings amongst people that follow Buddhism. The oldest manuscript or fragment of any of his teachings dates from about 100 to 300 AD. So this fragment was written down 400 to 700 years after he lived. So that's how far it is from when he originally spoke and taught. Remember, he didn't write anything down. Okay? And it was found in Pakistan. Now, this bottom line I had when I was teaching in Cambodia. This teaching is not accepted by Buddhists in Cambodia. They follow a whole different stream of Buddhism. So this manuscript wouldn't mean anything to them, but to other Buddhists it would. This would be, considered a sacred manuscript. The oldest manuscript of Buddhist teachings that would be accepted in Cambodia was found in Burma. It was written down about 29 BC, originally, the teachings, 450 years after Buddha lived. The fragment that they have is from the 5th to 6th century AD. So that fragment is separated from when Buddha lived by 1,000 years. So that would be like if anything written that Jesus said that we had was from 1,000 AD compared to when he lived. Okay, a gap. But as you've seen, that fragment that I showed you from John, that was 100 years after Jesus lived. So the gap for Jesus' teachings and manuscripts in the New Testament is very small compared to the gap for Buddhism. So here's a way of looking at it. Compare the two timelines. Buddha lives back here, 563 to 483 BC, writes nothing down. Records from later say that his teachings were first written down here, 500-ish years after he lived. But here is where the oldest manuscripts are from. So the gap between what the oldest manuscript and when he taught is more than 1,000 years. And as we've seen, the longer the gap, scholars say the greater the chance that there were things lost or things added that weren't there originally or things changed. The smaller the gap, the less chance of that. Okay. So here's a way to look at it on a chart. He lives 563 to 483 BC. Jesus lives AD 1 to 33. And again, I'm playing with those dates a little bit, but his teachings were written down about 29 BC, so 400 years later. Jesus' teachings were written down somewhere in here, 17 to 47 years after he lived. Very close to when he lived. His followers were writing down or recording what he taught so it wouldn't be lost. The oldest piece of manuscript for Buddhist teachings, again, as we've said, dates 4 to 600 AD, about 1,000 years after he lived, 600 years after the original was written. For Jesus, the oldest piece of manuscript is from AD 125, so 45 years from when the original was written down, about 92 years after he lived. So you can see how close that is compared to here. Oldest complete teaching, copy of Buddha's teachings, again, same, it's about 1,000 years from when he lived. Jesus, that Bible, that New Testament from 350, so that's about 317-ish years after he lived. So again, the gap is very small compared. Anybody like to comment or ask anything? Do you see the importance of that? Or let me ask it a different way. What do you see as the importance of that, of us knowing that as Christians? Back to Christy and then to Rob.
I get a little tired of hearing random people say that the Bible's a copy of a copy of a copy, and then you look at the evidence of what the copies are and compare them to other manuscripts, and people just don't even know what they're talking about.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. Yeah. Rob?
Basically, the apologetics of it, right? I mean, it really happened, and it's interesting how the different religions get passed on, even cultures, through oral tradition. When I read that book, The Empire of the Harvest Moon, based on the Comanches, they never wrote anything down. They did do some artwork, but everything was basically their whole history was passed on through oral tradition. Mm-hmm. So that's quite interesting.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Let's compare it to the writings of Islam. So, Muhammad, again, I am no expert on Islam, but these are some general things that are true and that can help us in comparing. he lives 500 to 600 years after Jesus, so AD 570 to 632. He's born in the city of Mecca. He's orphaned at the age of 6, raised by his uncle mostly, and then he dies in another city called Medina. In AD 610, he said that the angel Gabriel spoke to him in a cave and gave messages to him. He's understood by his followers as a prophet, not as a god, not as a son of God, but a prophet. That God spoke to him just like God spoke to Isaiah and the prophets of the Old Testament. It says that he first thought it was a demon that was speaking to him. He was afraid of what was going on. Now, his wife had a Christian cousin who told him that his messages he was getting were from God. And that's interesting. And then he starts sharing those messages and proclaiming himself to be a prophet from God, that God was speaking to him through the angel. At the beginning, most of the Arab people in his city where he lived in Mecca, they were polytheistic. They believed in many gods, idols, like we read about in the Old Testament, and they rejected him. He was not accepted by his people at the beginning. He goes on to capture the city of Mecca and be more like a political military leader in that area. And he claimed that through his life, right up until his death, that God kept appearing to him or sending an angel to appear to him to give him messages. So as a prophet, bringing more revelation from God that sort of added to the Old Testament, added to the New Testament. He viewed Jesus as a prophet, someone that God spoke to and gave teachings, and Muhammad, his followers and him, they saw himself as the last final prophet that was bringing the rest of the message from God. And then he was buried in the city of Medina. He was illiterate. He didn't read or write during his life. As Rob was saying about some other cultures, his teachings were passed on orally. So people would say what they had heard him say, and they would memorize his teachings. And they were not written down. Over time, controversy started to develop about what did he really say. Well, he taught this. Someone else would say, no, he didn't. He taught this. And they started to see there was no authoritative set of teachings of what he said. So very close, not far after his death, the leader in that time, Caliph Othman, he chose one scholar, and he told that scholar, you do your research, you determine what are his authoritative teachings, and we will accept what you decide. And then the Caliph ordered everything else, every other manuscript about his teachings was to be burned. So there would be one authoritative set of teachings decided by this one scholar. Now, how does that compare to how we ended up with one authoritative set of doctrines for the New Testament? When you think about the difference of that process to what we've said about how the New Testament came together. Diane?
Well, we have in the Bible actually the people who were with Jesus and everything, who wrote, who told their story and started writing things down, or someone who was with the apostle wrote things down, right?
Okay.
What the apostle said or whatever. And whereas this is, there's all these many different teachings that are going on, and no one knows what exactly is the right one. So one guy decides, and his research may have been flawed in certain areas, right? Mm-hmm. He might have tried his best, but there's a great chance that when people are telling you all kinds of stories, you're going to make a mistake or something like that, right? And just the timeline too, that this is all going on, that it's decided this is going to be what he said.
Okay.
600, like so many years after.
Okay,
right?
Thank you. If we could go to Larry.
What stands out to me is the great danger is one scholar deciding. Number one, it was all based on hearsay. And there evidently was controversy on what people interpreted from what they heard him say, Muhammad. Any translation of the Bible, whichever one you use, prefer, at the front of your Bible, there'll be some write-up, at least a page, telling the sources. And it scores to hundreds of biblical scholars who come together. Now, they can have prejudice, they can have certain theological positions that they may try to insert into the translation, but you've got all of these guys and girls who come together, who've studied academically the original languages, the history, the traditions, and they bounce off each other, they counter each other, they serve as, I forget the word.
Like a check and balance kind of?
A check and balance, thank you. But when you leave it up to one person to make it's kind of scary.
Yeah. Yeah, there's the danger that that one person, although they might be honest and trying their best to make sure that they research, and this is the best we understand of what was said by this teacher, they could be wrong. They could make mistakes. And then when you burn and get rid of any other manuscripts, later, how can you ever do any further study or checking? Over time, more and more manuscripts are found. We talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in the 1900s. When those were found, now you can compare them to manuscripts from hundreds and hundreds of years earlier. When you burn and destroy everything except this one set that we've decided on, it's very hard to, well, you can't do comparisons. This suddenly becomes the authoritative document, and we really have no way of further studying, checking the accuracy of what we've decided on. So the oldest fragment of the Quran, and that is the collection of the Islamic writings, there are 60 manuscript fragments which date earlier than AD 800. So Muhammad lived, as I said, 500 to 600 AD in that period. From up to 200 years after he lived, there are only 60 manuscript fragments that exist in the world. And that's because they destroyed, once they had their authoritative set, they set out to burn and destroy everything else. So there's very, very few manuscripts to compare and look at. The parchment on the right here, so the parchment that it's written on can be dated. And that dates to 568 is before he started teaching and was born. 645 is just after. Okay? So that piece of parchment could have been prepared, just as a piece of parchment to be used before he was even born or during his life. I can't say exactly when the writing was done on it, but it's a very old document. The text of it is Exodus 4, verses 2 to 3 in the Quran, because a lot of the Quran is quoting the Old Testament, because Muhammad saw himself as a prophet continuing the line of prophets. And so things that have been said to other prophets, he would quote and use as, yes, God said this through this prophet, now he's saying this through me. Could I get someone to turn to Exodus 4 and just read verses 2 to 3 for us? Exodus 4, verses 2 to 3. Again, speaking about, this is an account of when the Lord spoke to Moses. Blaine, thank you.
Then the Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" "A staff," he replied. The Lord said, "Throw it on the ground." Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand.
Okay. So that's just one example of part of the Old Testament that is reproduced in the Quran. The oldest complete Quran, so the oldest complete New Testament, we said, is from 350 AD, so 300 years after Jesus lived. The oldest almost complete Quran, it's 98% complete. It's in this palace or museum in Istanbul. It dates from AD 750. So that copy is only from 118 years after Muhammad's death. So that copy is closer to his life than the oldest copy of the New Testament is to Jesus' life. So the gap is smaller. But as we've said, all the other manuscripts, the decree was to burn and get rid of them. So although you have this, how accurate is it to what he originally said? That's the difficulty. So it's not always just the gap that you're looking at. It's how many manuscripts are there to compare things to. So as Larry was saying, to do double checks and to cross-check things. So again, to compare, we've looked at sort of the timeline of the New Testament of Buddha's teachings. So Muhammad lives here, 570 to 630. The oldest manuscript fragment is from very close to his life. And the oldest complete, the Quran, also very close to his life. But, as we've said, there's other things that cause doubt in what we have here. Is it what he taught or not? Is it complete or not? And so again, just to do a comparison, Jesus lives in the 1st century up to 33 AD. Muhammad lives 500 some years later. Jesus' teachings were written down 17 to 47 years later. Muhammad's very close to after he died. They started to write down what they believed he had said. The oldest piece of manuscript of his teachings is from 10 years after the originals, 13 years after he lived. Jesus, 45 years after the original, that fragment of John, 92 years after he lived. And the oldest complete copy of Muhammad's teachings from about 100 and some years after he lived. Jesus, about 300 years. Get a microphone to Larry.
Just a thought of speculation. One reason I think they got a complete manuscript so early after his death was the ultimatum of that Caliph Uthman, who said, this is what we're going to do, and you're going to be the one talking to the scholar who is going to decide. He understood the urgency to get this thing wrapped up, but if no one had stepped up to do that, I wonder how many centuries it would have continued to be debatable among the Muslims. What did he really say? It could have extended for centuries.
Yeah, that definitely pushed getting it gathered together. Just like when Emperor Diocletian said, every manuscript, anything written about Christianity is to be completely destroyed in the Roman Empire. That was part of what caused the Christians to protect, preserve, and decide on, what are our teachings. Up to then, as we've said, there was no head office, no central authority. The church was, a collection of congregations all around the Mediterranean. As the apostles died out, there wasn't, central command leadership or anything. It was very organic, but that brotherhood knew and had accepted which of the letters that they had that were circulating were from apostles, and so there was an understanding amongst the believers that was developing. It just wasn't formal or formalized till later. Okay, it's not just about the gap, and I want to finish with this today, about the copy we have, how close to the original. It's also about how many manuscripts do we have. Okay? So, of the New Testament, there are more than 5,300 manuscripts written in Greek. Now, that doesn't mean complete New Testaments. It could be a piece, like we saw of John. It could be one letter. But these are handwritten copies from before there was printing, written in Greek, which was the language of the Roman Empire at that time in the 1st century. That's a lot. I'm sorry, that first one is entire New Testaments. There are over 10,000 Latin Vulgate manuscripts. So as the Roman Empire, as Latin becomes the language, copies and copies and copies made. where there are 10,000 copies. And there are at least 9,300 other early manuscripts, pieces of parts of the New Testament. When you put that all together, there are more than 24,000 recognized manuscripts, handwritten pieces or complete portions of the New Testament that exist in libraries and museums around the world. That's tremendous, tremendous manuscript support for these documents. That you can compare all these different manuscripts written at different times in history, made copies of John or 1 Corinthians or... Okay. Just as a comparison, what ancient book would have the closest number to the Bible for manuscript support? If that's number one, what's the ancient book that's got the next largest number of manuscript support? Well, Homer, Greek scholar that wrote the Iliad. You may have been forced to read that in school. I don't think I was. Linda's nodding. It's a bit of a heavy read. But the Greek people considered it a sacred book. There are 643 manuscripts existing in the world of the Iliad, or pieces of it. Who questions that Homer wrote the Iliad? I've never heard anyone question that. Right? It's studied in universities. This is the Iliad, written by Homer, these years. It's a lot of manuscripts. Compare that to 24,000 manuscripts in support of the Bible, having originally been written in the first century, the New Testament. So this idea that it's, kind of been thrown together loosely over the centuries and we don't really know who wrote what, and religious people made up a lot of the story, and the manuscript evidence doesn't support that. Okay? It's a very, very solidly supported document. Now, we haven't talked about, when it says God spoke to this person, did God really? We've just been talking about the writing down of it, not the proof that it is from God. Okay? Any comments to that? Okay, we'll end up here then. Get through this. So let's take two others that people would consider to be, important writers. Who's ever heard of Plato or Aristotle? Right? We all have. People talk about these great philosophers. Plato lived 400 to 347 BC. The earliest copy of his teachings is from 900 AD, 1,200 years after he lived. And there are seven manuscripts of Plato's teachings. And the oldest one is from 1,200 years after he lived. Aristotle, again, lived 300 years before Jesus. The earliest copy of his writings from 1100 AD, 1,400 years after he lived and wrote. And there are 49 manuscripts, pieces, or complete copies of what he wrote, existing, found in the world so far. We've also talked about Homer, 643, and then the New Testament. So it should show us that we can be very, very confident with what we have. Okay, good place for us to stop there. And we'll continue next week, starting to talk about the variations, because every copy of the New Testament isn't the same, the manuscripts. So we'll start talking about that next time. Thank you.
Amen. Amen. Good morning, church. It is time for us to begin this morning. Please filter in and find a seat as we come to worship our God. Do me come. Now is the time to worship. Come. Now is the time to give your heart. Come, just as you
One day every tongue will confess you are God. One day every knee will bow. So one day the greatest truth remains for those who gladly choose